When people ask me about what are the main ethical risks of AI, I point them in the direction of three major ones: discriminatory or biased AI, black box models, and privacy violations. And the reason I think that those are the, if you like, the go-to three ethical risks of AI is that it's because the nature of how AI works. AI or machine learning, and I'm using them interchangeably, is pattern recognition software. And those patterns can be discriminatory in nature. They can be too complex for us to understand. And those patterns can be about people. And so we've got those three big issues just by virtue of how AI or ML works. So I think those are the three big issues. And then I like to talk about use case specific risks. So for instance, if you're using an AI to create a self-driving car, now you've got killing and maiming pedestrians as a new ethical risk. That's not because of the nature of the beast that is machine learning, but rather the purposes to which you're putting the beast. But there's a way in which my response is too narrow, or if someone objected and said, look, that response is too narrow, I get that from the following perspective, and this is what comes out in my conversation with Aimee. One of the core things about ML is that it requires a tremendous amount of processing power, And that processing power requires lots of energy. And if you're using up lots of energy, then of course you're having a big environmental impact. So arguably one thing that I should be highlighting more is the environmental impacts of, say, training models. So what was the environmental impact, for instance, of training ChatGPT 3.5 and 4.0, et cetera, with the countless parameters or the at least undisclosed parameters that it was trained on? So that's arguably one thing that I should be focused on. And we should also mention it's not just the environmental impacts, but also the social impacts that are at least partly the result of those environmental impacts, right? So if you are using processing power, it's having an environmental impact. Perhaps that environmental impact is disproportionately felt by people who have little resources to begin with, and so they are disadvantaged in a great way, or they're harmed, or they're perhaps wronged by the training of AI by virtue of its environmental impact. So that's really what a lot of my discussion is about with Aimee, who really wants to, justifiably, reasonably at least, focus on the broader environmental and social impacts of AI. Now, I still think, though, there are a lot of ethical dilemmas that we have to face here. Aimee and I begin to talk about these things. So for instance, you might think, listen, we need to make sure that those people in developing countries who are bearing the brunt of the environmental impact of climate change to begin with, and it's being increased by AI, let's say, we should make sure that they benefit from the development of AI, and they shouldn't be left out. And that's reasonable. On the other hand, what if I say, as I did to Aimee, look, what's going to happen is they're not going to be benefited first. We're going to wind up benefiting us first and then them. And while maybe that's not ideal, that's okay. And I think that Aimee was not, open to that, but her initial instinct was, again, not totally unreasonably, in my estimation anyway, her instinct was, no, we need to prioritize benefiting them. So number one, I think it's really important, useful, interesting to make sure that we take that more global perspective, an environmental perspective, the social impacts of those environmental impacts. We need to think about that when we think about the ethical impacts of AI. But we also have to recognize that it puts us toe-to-toe with really deep, hard questions about what constitutes just, fair distributions of goods and the order in which people benefit from those goods. So that's what a lot of this conversation is about. I think it's a really fascinating one and should, as it did mine, I hope, broaden your perspective about what AI ethics includes beyond the standard stalking horses of privacy, bias, and explainability. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I know I did. All right, Aimee, so we talked a couple of days ago, and you said, you told people you were getting into sustainable AI, and people said, look, that's just a couple of buzzwords shoved together. Now, presumably, it's not that. So tell me, what's sustainable AI?
So when I was first thinking about the topic of sustainable AI, I really had this idea of environmental consequences in my head. And so I could have called it environmental justice AI. Yeah, but so I guess
Big clunky.
yeah,
It's
it's
clunky.
clunky. Yeah. So sustainable
Yeah.
AI had a nice ring to it. And it was also this idea of when we think about sustainability, sometimes we can think about the idea of just sustaining, maintaining practices, but there's also another way of looking at it in terms of repairing practices. So I had a few different things going on in my head. This focus on what is happening to the environment when we're making and using artificial intelligence, and is there a way that we can not maintain, but also repair the practices that the infrastructure that we are currently locking ourselves into, and repair this for a more sustainable, a system that we actually want to maintain. So that's a little bit about where the idea was coming from. And of course it is now, yeah, progressed or developed as I learn more and more about the environmental consequences and how, yeah, how do I describe it? Like how broad they are, that it's not just carbon emissions that we're talking about, that it's, the female experience over in Ghana or in sub-Sahara Africa who is dealing with the contamination of soil and water. And we don't want to maintain those practices. We want to repair those practices. And so I wrap all of that up into this umbrella of sustainable AI.
All right. So there's the United Nations Sustainability Development
Hmm.
Goals, and it sounds like you're not focused on those as such, or maybe you are. When you say sustainable, you mean what they used to mean by sustainable, which was something like in forestry, it had to do with being, using enough, not using so much that you can't grow the forest
Hmm.
back and then use it again, so that it's stable for future
Hmm.
generations. So it sounds like it's more along those almost old school notion of
Hmm.
sustainability, legit, just not. It's not as broad as sustainability is used now by, say, corporate America, but
Hmm.
it's or by the United Nations for that
Hmm.
matter. But it's narrower to be the environment, and it sounds like also the impacts, the societal impacts
Hmm.
of environmental disaster. Is that right
Yeah,
so
yeah,
far?
yeah, yeah. And I think too that what's happened now is we are in this. It's not anything new, but it's this narrative of technological solutionism. This idea that we have problems, global issues. We have the sustainable development goals of these ideals that we want to achieve, and now we're looking at how we can achieve them. And AI is being slapped on as like the band-aid. Yeah, the
Sure,
technology is going to solve this for us. Yeah.
sure,
And
sure.
so what I'm trying to do, and when I first got into this space, sustainable AI was synonymous with AI for the SDGs. And
Okay,
so
yeah, AI for good
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
exactly. And so what I'm trying to do is to say, no, 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 that's not all there is to sustainable AI. There is, of course, this branch, how can we use the technology to achieve sustainable ends? But there's also this branch of what is the sustainability of the technology, of making and using the technology. And maybe in the next 5 years, we will come to a conclusion where we say, you can't even say AI for the SDGs if you are not measuring carbon emissions, understanding the procurement chain, who's labeling the data, are the mines accredited, right? Like, are the mining conditions slave like conditions, or do we have appropriate mining conditions?
So okay, I think we're quite on the same page. Since the thing that I always focus on, I make this distinction between AI for good and AI for not bad.
Hmm.
And AI for good is how do we use the powerful tool that is AI to promote positive social impact, and the positive social impact usually gets cashed out in the language of sustainability or the SDGs or
Hmm.
whatever. And I always think that's good, but AI for not bad needs to be prioritized. It just means how do we not ethically screw things
Hmm.
up? How do we not go off the ethical guardrails in using AI? And it sounds like that's what you're focused
Hmm.
on. I tend to focus more on, you might say, frankly, narrower issues
Hmm.
like black box stuff and discriminatory AI,
Hmm.
or biased AI and privacy violations. But it sounds like you're focused on a broader, arguably broader set of issues or something like that, where it's something like
Hmm.
environmental impacts and the toll it takes on people to make AI a usable technology.
Well, I think also what I'm trying to focus on is this idea that we are in the middle of a climate crisis. And this is something that at least I hope at this point is not we don't have too much denial on that fact, but yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
sure,
yeah, yeah.
sure.
But we are in, what is it, Code Red for Humanity is what the IPCC had said in the last report. And so, yes, we can talk about the black box and the biases that exist in society that are exacerbated, perpetuated through the training of the algorithm. Or we can also take a step even, one step back even further and say, wait a
Yeah,
second. Yes, we have all of these ethical issues, but before we even get started on those ethical issues, we're talking about the creation of a technology that is perpetuating a global problem. And so
yeah.
why are we even moving forward with this technology? And I also think, sorry, I see that you have another question, but I also think that the concern of the black box and the biases in training data, it's almost a luxury to have those
Mm.
problems. Would think about the small farms and the families on the continent of Africa, right? And they're worried, do they have food today, tomorrow, till the end of this week? They have no clean drinking water, or they're walking miles and miles to get clean water. And then we ask them, how do you feel about the black box? Like, how do you feel about
Right, right.
biases? And they're going to say, like, what?
I,
So,
I could give a
yeah,
shit.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So I really, while of course I'm not trying to undermine or to say that these are not relevant and important ethical issues, I'm
yeah, yeah,
saying
yeah,
think about the global community. We are so lucky
yeah.
that that's what we're concerned with.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a totally fair point. Like I said, I think my set of concerns that I focus on are narrower than
Mm,
yours. Yours are literally
mm,
global in a way that I don't think mine really are. So let me ask you this. I mean, one reason why I talk about the issues that I do is because I'm talking to, a CIO or CTO, someone very senior level on the tech side of
mhm,
a enterprise, a Fortune 500, whatever
mhm,
company, and I can get them, I can move them on issues pertaining to black box and discrimination, et cetera. I can't move them. They don't. It's not that they don't care. They don't have the authority
mhm,
or the buy-in from even more senior leaders, say the board or the CEO, to care about, for instance, the environmental impacts of
mhm.
AI. So I guess my question is something like, who's your audience? Who are you trying to reach? Who do you think are the people that need to be made aware of the
Mhm.
issue, and what do they need to do?
Mhm. So,
I mean, it's one thing to say something like corporations should stop and blah blah blah, but of course
mhm,
that doesn't speak to anything, not anything real in their,
mhm,
amongst their motivations. You're not going to convince them to be like, you know what, we should scale back our AI
mhm,
efforts and cut way down on potential profit because of the environment. That's just like
mhm.
a very small subset of companies will do
Yeah.
that. But are corporations your sort of target audience, or is it more government? Is it what is it?
So
Who
it's
is it?
both. So it's actually corporations, it's policymakers and consumers. It's also individuals in society that I think don't, Kate Crawford talks about this in her book about the lack of
Yeah,
understanding that there's a physical infrastructure. And,
yeah,
whoever did the marketing on the cloud, yeah, or algorithms, yeah, it seems
yeah,
not of this earth. Yeah, you don't understand that there's a physical infrastructure. So part
sure,
part of my goal, part of my work is really to remind people that every time you do a search, the phone that you're using, all of the different apps that are on there, there is a data center. There's, energy required for all of this. And so maybe we should also think about how us as individuals are consuming artificial intelligence, if that makes sense to say. I'm
yeah,
also thinking about policymakers because companies will respond when there are governance measures in place. Yeah, if policymakers say, okay, now it's time, you have to measure carbon emissions when you're training, or you have
mm-hmm,
to use renewable energy in terms of how your data
mm-hmm,
centers and whatnot are yeah based on. And so if we have policymakers engaged and thinking about that, then we can see some real change happening in the corporation space, in the industry space. But
mm-hmm.
also speaking to industry, so I had the same role as you where I was talking to them about black box, about how you collect your data, how you're going to use your data, how you label your data and
Yeah,
whatnot. But I'm also finding when I speak to corporations, to industry, they are interested in efficiency now, especially here in
sure,
Germany,
that's
right?
fair.
We're in the middle of an energy crisis. So
Mm-hmm,
everyone is trying to reduce their consumption of energy or looking for renewable
mm-hmm.
energy sources. So
Yeah,
now the
yeah,
conversation has changed. And while, of course, my hope would be that the conversation was changing, not because we're in the middle of an energy crisis, but because companies believe that it was the right thing to do.
Mm,
I still think that there's some teeth to this idea of sustainable AI. This idea that this is something that globally we could get behind. This is different from ethics guidelines and ethics principles where, how does China view the value of dignity versus the European Commission? And then can we
sure.
see eye to eye? How do we do this?
Right.
Sustainability or environmental damage is something, we will have different normative grounding. We need this because of future populations or current populations. Okay, so we can have our differences in
Sure.
terms of normative grounding, but I feel like there's some teeth in that. We can all globally, we can all get behind this idea of not only reducing consumption, but measuring and having an idea of what kind of consequences are we talking about. This is also fascinating. We don't even know how bad the carbon emissions problem is or the mining of precious minerals is because no companies are required to provide that information.
Sure. So, okay, so you wave a magic wand, and what happens? Like,
Yeah,
obviously, I mean, from sort of a kind of, regulatory
I hear
perspective.
you.
What are companies doing
Yeah,
differently? What are governments doing differently? What are they requiring that they don't require
yeah,
now? What's
yeah.
happening?
So I'm going to wave the magic wand 2 times, if you'll allow me.
Yeah,
The first
I
time, thank
allow.
you. The first time that I wave my magic wand, we have a requirement for measuring energy consumption and the associated carbon emissions, as well as the differences between types of algorithms. So whether it's machine learning, symbolic reasoning, whatnot. So we have an idea of the differences in the size or the methodology and their associated energy consumption. We also have a requirement that there is a tracking in the same way that you have, we have over here Tony Chocoloni, we have fair trade, things like that, where you have to track
Mm-hmm.
what are the working conditions for the people on the farms, what are the working
Mm,
conditions at every step of the way in the life cycle of tea, chocolate, coffee, that kind of thing. I
sure.
would say the
Yeah.
first wave is that we have this mandatory tracking of energy consumption and this mandatory tracking of working conditions throughout the entire procurement chain. So that's my first
Okay.
wave. My second
I like
wave
it.
then is once we have this information, the next step is then to perhaps put a cap on the amount of energy that you are allowed to use or the amount of carbon emissions that are allowed for the training of certain algorithms. Perhaps put a cap or perhaps put requirements on you cannot, for example, use refugees in refugee camps or prisoners in the prison system to label data once we have found out what is actually happening, once we have transparency. So the first wand, transparency. Second wand is
Sure.
then governing the system. And that means it's going to be more expensive. That means autonomous vehicles are probably not as close as we think because it's going to cost a lot more to hire
Mm.
people to label the training data. But that's the reality of it. That's what we see when we look at fair trade coffee versus unfair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate versus unfair chocolate. Yeah, we see that it's more expensive because you're actually paying for the labor that's involved.
So is so non-fair trade coffee is not illegal. It's not regulated
Right.
against. Is that right?
That's right.
I don't know much about the coffee industry, but that sounds right. So then the question is, I mean, if we go on the fair trade model, it would be sort of an opt-in
Mm-hmm.
to do fair trade
Mm-hmm.
AI, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak,
Mm-hmm.
right? But do you want to make it the case? Do you think it ought to be the case that no, fair trade is the only legally permissible
Yes.
way?
Yes. Yes. And I think it should be the same for chocolate and for coffee as well. But I think especially for AI, we are talking about, especially with Chat GPT that's come out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a game changer. People across the globe are looking at the capabilities of this technology, but also it's open access, right? You and I can randomly be converting our CVs into poems and things like that, right?
Sure.
This does need to be regulated because we climate crisis wise, we don't have a choice anymore. I don't understand why
Yeah,
we
so
think
that's
that we have a choice.
because it's well, okay. We could talk about that in a bit, But what I sort of find interesting about this last point is that using AI creates a big environmental impact. It's right now, GPT is in the hands of millions, hundreds of millions, I think at this point. I mean, it passed 100 million in the first 2 months of release, and I don't know where we are now, but more than 100 million. And people are using it for frivolous purposes.
Students using it to write their papers.
Well, there's some concerns like, oh, we're allowed. So there's two. There's one is that they're using it in ways that they ought not to, because what they're doing is somehow objectionable in itself, like having it write your paper for you when the professor forbids such a thing. The other side, though, is that you're not doing that something that's as such objectionable, like turning your CV into a poem. It's just so freaking trivial. And so because you just want to have a bit of fun for 10 seconds, you want to, have your bio in a haiku form or whatever, you're gonna have an environmental, you're gonna have that kind of impact on the environment for something so trivial. So there's ethically objectionable uses, but there's also just frivolous uses that are objectionable on the grounds of the impact that it causes. And you take all these frivolous people doing frivolous things, myself included, because I had never thought of it, and there's an aggregate big impact.
Yeah. And that's where I was trying to go when you said, who is my target audience? And I said, consumers, policymakers, and industry. I think consumers, do we call individuals who are using ChatGPT consumer because it's not free? Users, I think users need to be aware of the impact. And I think it's going to be awful if we get into a situation. So I also wanted to premise that idea with, it's not only the user's responsibility, because I hate the fact that right now I want to minimize my plastic usage. I want to minimize as much as possible the materials that come in. But when I buy tomatoes at the grocery store, there's the paper bottom and then the plastic on top. And it's like, come on.
Sure.
And this is my responsibility now to recycle this. You have the responsibility.
So let me push back in three respects.
Uh-oh.
So one, I might forget the third by the time I get to it. One is that I don't see the point of putting the onus on individual users. It's an impossible,
I hear you.
It's impossible to get people to think about that. My own individual contribution is minimally impactful on the environment. You're using that one piece of plastic or whatever on the tomato. It's not going to move the needle. If you went completely plastic free, you're not going to have an impact by yourself on the outcome of all of this, right? We're all going to die anyway. So,
am I allowed to interrupt you? Am I allowed to go back and forth? Or are you not going to get to your third?
Sure, yeah. No,
so
go ahead.
I hear you on that. It's not about the onus on the individual to make the big change. It's on the onus of the industry to make this change. But the individuals have power. Yeah. And then you start to have these movements where you have protests, or you have individuals saying I'm not going to shop there. I'm not going to buy this product because the amount of plastic that you use is ridiculous. So I think there is so much power that the individual has to put pressure on policymakers, on industry. That's more what I meant. And you only get that when you have the awareness. That's where it was.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm totally skeptical about sort of individuals unilaterally just doing some stuff. And that feels to me like symbolic. It's a symbolic gesture and it makes people feel good. It has absolutely no genuine impact. But I agree. When people say something like, what should I do? I say, find other people and as a group, lobby for new policies and regulations, laws, whatever it is. The groups have power. The only power the individual has is to form a group or join a group and have that collective power. So I think that's right. One thing about frivolity is that it can be a creative act, and you never know what it's going to lead to. And so I'd be worried that if you say, okay, no more frivolous uses of GPT or something along those lines, whatever that law would actually amount to, you'd also be hampering creativity, innovation, etc. And we want people to explore and figure out use cases that you might not have otherwise unless you got the opportunity to play with it a bunch.
So I agree with you. Of course, I've heard so many times about how ethics stifles innovation, right? And but at the same time, there are things.
And it does stifle innovation, by the way. That's the point. I mean, I don't like when people say, no, it doesn't. It only makes it more creative. No, the point of ethics and regulations is precisely so that you don't innovate in ways that are ethically bad.
Right.
So if you say, I'm going to stifle you from innovating the next atom bomb.
Yeah, but I would say it doesn't necessarily stifle innovation. So wait, first of all, there are certain innovations that need to be stifled, right? We shouldn't have autonomous killing robots. for example.
Totally.
Eh,
Yeah.
that I think it's safe to say that that should be stifled. On the other hand, the way that I work with ethics is to try and use ethics to empower good kinds of innovation. What do we mean when we say good kinds of innovation? Well, innovation that respects human rights. And so I think we can still have this in the AI space. And I think we can still have these
Yeah.
sandboxes, these places to play around and to have this frivolity. But at the moment, it's it's too much without knowing what the consequences are. And we had the same thing with plastic. And now we're looking back and looking at the oceans being like, what were we thinking? Why did we think that this was such a good idea? And we're going to do the same thing 2 years, 5 years from now. We're going to look back and be like, what were we thinking? Everyone was allowed to play with this thing. And now look at where we're at. And also thinking about social media, we have all of these
Sure.
free social media, yeah, Facebook, WhatsApp, all of this stuff, and people can't pull themselves away from it because it's free and it's so convenient. And we're in another situation where I bet you it's going to be so difficult to pull people away from GPT, from Chat GPT, because it's
Oh
free
yeah.
and it's so convenient. And we're
Yeah.
repeating history.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I'm going to keep pushing though
Go for it.
because I want more. I want more. So, if you want to put a cap on all these things, so here I'm sort of channeling some people at Microsoft who work on GPT and healthcare. So there's a really good book out by some researchers. One of the researchers at Microsoft, Peter Lee. There's a good paper out written by Eric Horvitz and others.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming from Microsoft, so one has to raise an eyebrow, of course.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth noting that for at least Peter's book, it explicitly says, and I spoke to him about it, that Microsoft had zero oversight over the content of the book. They just said, go write it and we won't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like there are some phenomenal benefits. There are in healthcare, in particular, healthcare and life sciences. The ability for this thing to diagnose people with literally one in a million disease, its ability to correct the judgments of especially medical students and residents in differential diagnoses, the availability of that kind of diagnostic power globally. So for those people in those villages in Africa who are suffering in various ways, there might be ways of getting them, so to speak, a phenomenal doctor to diagnose them. So I guess my question is something like, in your sort of calculus about what we ought to do, or in your deliberations or reasoning about what we ought to do, shouldn't we take those kinds of massive global benefits to humanity? And it's not just, that's a nice to have. It's literally saving countless lives. Do we need to take that into account, or how do we take that into account in thinking about whether there ought to be a cap and what that cap should be?
So I think also when I'm talking about a cap, and we were just talking about frivolity, the frivolous use cases. So then we have to start to identify what is frivolous and what is not frivolous. So the kinds of examples that you're giving right now don't appear at first hand as being frivolous, right?
Yeah,
We're talking
yeah,
about the potential to
totally.
save lives.
Yeah.
Then on second glance, though, I have actually one of my senior researchers here at the Institute for Science and Ethics at the Bonn Sustainable AI Lab, who is looking at this question in particular. And this is the idea of proportionality. And so when it really comes down to it, the people that are going to benefit from this technology are the people usually not in the global south.
Yeah, the big corporations. Sure.
Right. The big corporations, you and I living in North America, living in Europe, we are going to benefit from the technology. So then when we take everything put together, we have massive environmental consequences and damage. The people who are exposed to this and who are experiencing this in the most awful way are not the same people who are going to have the benefits and the rewards of this technology. So that's sort of on second glance.
Will they not have it, or will they just have it later than everybody else?
See, this is a question. This is a good question, and this is when I think talking about global regulation or global policy and global governance becomes really important, because we should be talking about how to develop and design these tools so that we all benefit. Because what I'm also getting at with the field of sustainable AI is trying to recognize that there is no such thing as AI made in Germany or AI made in the EU or in North America. It is a global endeavor. Where the materials come from, who's doing the training, this is happening all over the world. And it's only certain communities that are benefiting from it. And then when you also talk about, like, okay, will they receive the benefits later? Will they never receive the benefits? You have to understand the infrastructure of the different continents that we're talking about. So before I was in AI, I did the ethics of robotics. And we talk about surgical robots, and that these could be amazing in a country like Ghana, where you don't have surgeons who are trained in the same way as surgeons in North America or in Europe. You could have a surgeon in Europe performing a surgery on an
Sure.
individual in Ghana. I mean, it sounds amazing, doesn't it? It sounds fantastic. Yeah. But then, so that's the first glance. Second glance is understand what this actually means. When you know how robotic surgery works, you cannot do the surgery without having an experienced surgeon there on site, because if anything goes wrong and you have to dismantle, take out the robotic apparatus, you need someone on site to perform the surgery. Okay, so you
Sure.
still need the expert there. Also, the last time that I was in Ghana, you would see that at night there was no street lights because they didn't have the energy. So instead of using energy to facilitate the community, we're going to redirect the minimal amount of energy that they have for a surgical robot. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so fine. It doesn't make any sense there. I say. Right. This is me pushing back, obviously. So suppose I actually don't have a view. I don't have a view. So this is just sort of me exploring.
Okay.
So I say, okay, look, there's sort of in the background, it feels to me like the demand for something like equity, you haven't used the word equity, but it seems to be floating around, is subject to what gets called the leveling down objection, which is something like, look, you want to make everyone, you want equitable outcomes, which is something like equal. You can use the word equitable to mean something like equal outcomes as opposed to just or fair, but a specific conception of what fairness or justice looks like. It's equality in outcome somehow. And you're right. We're going to develop these technologies and it will disproportionately benefit North American, et cetera, EU, et cetera. Okay, so what? The alternative is do we want, let's say, the people in Ghana and the people, let's just say, in the US or the EU. So people in Ghana, let's just arbitrarily assign them level 3, whatever that means, quality of life. Let's say we've got number 5, and we've got some technology that won't impact the Ghanese. They'll stay the 3, but it'll take everyone else from a 5 to a 7. Should we not do it then? In the name of equity? Because we want to, if you pull down the people in the EU, ideally we want to pull up the Ghanese and or pull down the US by various distributions of resources. But if we've got the opportunity to massively benefit tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, while not simultaneously benefiting the worst off, is that ethically objectionable?
I think so. See where you're going with this argument, with this line of thought. And this is where I'm not a historian, but I have learned so much by working with the people from the University of Ghana, and learned so much about colonialism and how, and I mean, Ghana is one country, one example. Yeah. So I don't mean
Sure.
this to say this is the only example of colonialism,
Yeah.
but we're talking about, we have to remember the way that North America became rich, the way that the UK, the way that Europe became rich and had these possibilities is because there has been a consistent and systemic exploitation of the global South. And so I see where you're going with this. If we have the possibility to make it better for ourselves, why not? But that's the way of thinking that got us into this mess of climate change, climate crisis in the first place. There has to be a paradigm shift in the way that we think. That we have to say, okay, we're not going to lower our standards of living or our standards of care, but we need to pay tribute to the fact that we only have this high standard of living because of the exploitation of people and planet away from us. and we don't have to see them, and we don't have to understand what it is to live that experience. And so maybe this is too existential and philosophical and armchair philosophy. Maybe it's too optimistic. And I definitely understand the sort of the now thinking of like, well, we can do this. We can identify diseases, diagnose diseases, perhaps find a cure. And of course, who would I be to say that we shouldn't do that? But at the same time, to recognize we are only in this position. We only have the minerals for this physical infrastructure because there are people working in slave-like conditions in mines on a different continent. And so really, do we feel good about ourselves saying like, well, let's do it because we could save a few more of us?
Yeah. So there's a couple lines of reasoning here, and I'm sort of want to poke around a bit. So one of them is something like, we owe it to them. If you look at the history, the position that they're in now is largely the result of the activities of the colonialists.
Absolutely.
And so as a matter of reparative justice, as a matter of reparations, we ought to make sure that we disproportionately benefit them as opposed to us.
Okay.
That's one kind of claim.
Okay, so I'm not saying disproportionately. Go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. So we have some level of we have obligations having to do with reparations of some kind for a morally checkered past, to put it mildly. That's one line of reasoning, and I want to distinguish that, the duty of reparation, from right now, today, in the way that we develop AI, we do it in a way that's ethically objectionable because it depends upon the exploitation of those who are alive right now. And so forget about what we've done in the past and sort of making amends for the past. There's also, right now, there are people in Ghana or wherever it is, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc., that are being used in various ways that is morally objectionable, arguably a violation of their rights, and so we shouldn't do it for those reasons.
Yes.
So it sounds like we've got those two kinds of things going on. Reparations and current day wrongs.
Yes, absolutely. And then also to speak to the reparations idea. So yes, I mean, I do think that that's a fair thing to say. That's not the main thrust of my argument, but also we are entering into a new age of digital colonialism. We are entering into a new kind of colonialism and a lack of digital sovereignty on the part of members of the Global South, that they do not have the physical infrastructure. They do not have the data centers or the computing power that we have over in the global north. Yeah. So they're in a situation, when I was in Ghana, I was learning about different algorithms that they were in the process of creating, an algorithm for diabetes, and how can people who are living with diabetes attain their lifestyle, check up on themselves and understand how to live appropriately according to the disease. And they explained to me, they said, of course, with an app like this, Aimee, you have to have an incredibly high level of accuracy. We don't have the power to get to train enough to get to this level of accuracy. So then we have to go to the big tech companies and say, can we use your infrastructure? We need energy. We need a computing system so that we can do this. So then you have this weird asymmetry in power, right? And of course, big tech says, of course you can, but we want access to your data and we get IP after this is trained, right? So it's one thing to talk about reparations, and it's another thing to acknowledge the fact that we have all of these benefits because we've exploited other continents, and we are in the process stepping into a new kind of exploitation. Well, similar exploitation, but just in the digital realm as well. They have no power. They have data. We want their data so that we can continue to train algorithms, and we're going to take it. It scares me.
Yeah. No, it's a problem.
Oh man, now I need a drink.
I guess though, one thing that I don't know the answer to, and this is not my area of expertise, but you'll see things like, people are working for $2 an hour, et cetera, or $1 an hour, or whatever. One thing that I never understood about that is, well, yeah, but their restaurants are a lot cheaper. I mean, if they have, their food is a lot cheaper than food in Brooklyn, New York, right? So I don't know how that translates. So it means nothing to me. But the other thing is, would they rather not work at all? And it's easy. I guess in some ways, the progressive in me wants to say something like, it's easy for us to say they shouldn't work at $1 an hour, but if the economics are such that the company will pull out otherwise and they won't give them any work, would they rather work for $1 an hour, whatever it is, whatever the unjust wage, assuming it's unjust, the unjust wage, or they would rather not work at all?
Well, that's a slippery slope, Reed. That's a slippery slope.
I agree.
Think about the children who are sewing clothes for, pennies on the item, but they'd rather work, right? Think about the children who line up to get, sexually abused on a camera because this is how they can make money and whatnot. But they'd rather do that because they can bring home money for their family. So I definitely hear what you're saying. This is a gray area.
Yeah, that's all. It's gray. That's all. Yeah. I mean, those things are awful. I mean, I'm not a moral monster over here. Right?
No, I understand.
Those things are horrendous. I just don't know. People do crazy shit, really bad things to keep their family alive, and they'd rather do those things than literally have their family die. And then do I defer to them as to what do we do here, or do I say do we come in as the saviors and say no? I mean, I just don't know I think it's better for those corporations to leave than for you to work under these conditions. I mean, I can't.
But I also think it's a dick move for the corporations to say, "Well, we're going to leave if we can't pay you $1 an hour."
100%, 100%.
Yeah,
of course.
I think, and the problem. So then we get into, again, what I'm trying to do with sustainable AI is to talk about how this is a global problem. There are systemic issues here that we need to deal with. It's not just one application or one algorithm, but what we need to start thinking about is, we get to use all of this technology for free or really cheap. We don't understand that it should be more expensive. It should be more expensive if we were paying these people a minimum wage.
So here's the thing. So, there's one reason why the word sustainable strikes me as so odd in this context, because I just think, well, we've sustained oppression since the beginning of humankind. Oppression is very sustainable. Treating people with a level of dignity, a level of respect that's commensurate with their dignity as human beings, that's really hard. That's less sustainable. It's way harder to do. It's like the ethically equivalent of, running a 5-minute mile, for an infinite marathon. It's really hard. So
I mean, for some of us, not for all of us.
For me, I'm just kidding. I'm sure you're a phenomenal runner. I mean, so
yeah.
It seems to me like, and then when people talk the language of sustainability, they're making the claim, as far as I can see, that it's an ethically good goal that is, and here's the empirical claim, conducive to the bottom line. And I sort of think that there's literally, hundreds, thousands of years of empirical evidence showing that actually exploiting them is really good for the bottom line.
Yeah, I hear you.
So it seems to me like, why make the stand, or why make the argument about sustainability and just say it's just fucking ethically disastrous. It's ethically disgusting, and it needs to stop on those grounds.
Yes, because not everyone understands ethics in the same way that you and I do, right? And people talk about how
human rights. It's an abomination to human rights. Yes. Why not just say, look, it's just about human rights and AI?
But not every country upholds human rights in the same way. Yeah, but every country, there's no way that you can deny that sustainability is a good goal to have, right? There's no denying there. But what I'm also trying to say is that sustainability is this kind of ethical Trojan horse. Yeah, you come in with sustainability. If we were to achieve sustainability in the way that I envision it, where you have this measuring, where you have this tracking of working conditions, you are tracking human rights. So it's not like the two conflate. Well, actually, maybe they do conflate into one another. And I'm thinking out loud. This is random to do in a podcast interview right now, but
it's a discussion, not an interview. So it's the appropriate thing.
But I'm thinking, maybe sustainable AI is this kind of ethical Trojan horse, where that's what sustainability is. Yeah. Yes.
It's just ethics. It's just ethical goals. It's straight. I recently wrote this piece, and it's a piece that I've been sitting on for literally years. When I left academia and I went to my first conference on sustainability, I thought it was going to be about the environment. And everyone's talking about these goals, like lifting women, lifting people out of poverty, educating women around the globe. I'm like, the hell is this got to do with sustainability? Yeah. This is just straight up ethical goals. But no one wanted to say the word ethics. Why not just say ethics? Just say the word. It's going to be okay. Or say, I like to say now, just say ethical nightmares.
Yeah.
These are ethical
Yeah.
nightmares. It's ethical nightmares if you've got children sewing and
Yeah.
women lining up for sexual favors so they can keep their
Yeah.
job, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
Yeah.
Those are ethical
Yeah.
nightmares. Just call
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think also, so so you have sustainability and then you have sustainable development. And with sustainable
Yeah.
development, you have these three pillars, right? Economic, ecological, and social. And I do find it fascinating that they are siloed, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're siloed off into these three pillars. And another thing that I'm trying to do with my research is to say that, especially the social and the environmental are two sides of the same coin. That if we
Yeah.
start by looking at the environmental consequences and damage, it opens our eyes to these other social issues that we had not taken into consideration. So I think
Yeah.
that's also an important aspect of the
I
research
think
that I'm
I
trying to
think
do.
that's right, but it's such. I think I think that it's a totally fair point. My concern from a sort of pragmatic point of view, like moving people to do better, so it's too long of a train of thought for
I
people.
know. I know.
don't-
I don't normally, give that train of thought. I'm doing this in our discussion right now. But really,
Yeah.
I'm really, when I'm speaking to policymakers, when I'm speaking to industry, I talk about the environmental consequences, how they are relevant not just for the global south, but also for the global north. Right? They're
Yeah, sure.
relevant for the global community. And so what
Yeah.
can industry do to minimize their environmental footprint? What can
Yeah.
policymakers do to understand the situation better? And I think that sustainable AI is the sort of key to, yeah, and talking with policymakers in Germany or in Europe, I say, why not have us be the leaders in green IT, in sustainable IT or
Yeah.
AI? It's also something that I don't understand why countries aren't getting behind that right now. Why not be the leader? Because we will have other
Because
countries.
you don't get elected on a positive
Yeah,
impact
that
that will be long
sucks.
after their tenure.
Yeah, that also sucks. That
It's not ideal.
pisses me off. Yeah. Yeah,
All right. Well, on that happy note,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
we should wrap up now. But thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I want to do it again. It definitely broadens my perspective. I mean,
Thank you.
like I said, I think my focus is narrow in a way, and there's a reason for it. But I'm all for broadening it.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Okay.
This is actually the first time that, in a discussion, not an interview, but in a discussion,
But yeah, whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
you were really challenging me to push my ideas to go further. I haven't thought about the sustainability as an ethical Trojan horse before, but I like it. You might see it in an upcoming paper now.
We'll talk
Thank
about
you.
it some more. Maybe we write something together. Who
Awesome.
knows?
That would be great.
All right.
Okay.
Great.
Bye.
All right.